Hi, everybody. We're going to now move on to Chapter 8, which covers energy metabolism. So this is going to be the last chapter of Unit 2. We've covered Chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, and now 8. And those are going to be the 5 chapters that are covered on the upcoming exam too. So as soon as you're completed watching the lectures, reading the book, and doing your homework, feel free to take on the exam. Now, in this chapter of energy metabolism, we're going to learn how the energy that comes in the form of kilocalories in our food transforms to the energy that's required for physical activity as well as thinking and growing. And we're going to talk about different types of these reactions that take place. We're going to talk about adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is the actual source of energy for use by our cells. And we're going to talk about how metabolism changes depending on how long it's been since the last meal that we've eaten. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, what is metabolism? Metabolism is the sum of all of the chemical reactions in the body that really occur in all systems of the body, that occur in all 10 trillion cells of our body. Now, it's the use the body makes of foods after they've been digested, absorbed, and circulated to the different cells. So these are some chemical reactions that occur during the breakdown, the digestion of our food, the absorption of our food, and how that then gets circulated to the cells, and how our body is going to use this food in 2 different ways. The first is as an energy source. Now, the energy is actually stored in the bonds that connect the molecules that make up carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So when we talked about carbohydrates, we talked about how carbohydrates are composed of chains of monosaccharide units. And those monosaccharide units are connected via bonds known as glycosidic bonds. Now, conversely, proteins have amino acids that are linked together by a peptide bond to form a protein. It's these bonds that carry a large amount of potential energy. And when those bonds get broken during a metabolic reaction, it releases a tremendous amount of energy. Now, this reaction occurs through 2 different processes, one being an aerobic process with oxygen, aerobe meaning with oxygen, and through anaerobic reactions, which means without oxygen. So these different reactions are going to be necessary in order to facilitate enough energy being brought to the cell. Now, we're going to talk about the building blocks for complex chemical compounds in the body and how the body is going to use these different chemical compounds to facilitate the metabolic process. Now, when it comes to metabolism, our bodies are comprised of all of these trillions of different cells, and each cell has an individual job to carry out. So even though each of these cells is going to perform different metabolic functions, these functions or metabolic reactions are going to require a certain amount of energy in order to carry them out. And as you can imagine, metabolism is necessary to meet the body's constant need for energy supply. Metabolism never stops. Even if we're not currently eating food or digesting the food or absorbing the food, our bodies are carrying out metabolic processes all the time, whether it's through a digestive process, neurological signaling, maybe muscle contraction, whatever the case may be, there are many different metabolic reactions happening in our body, and that metabolic reactivity never stops. Our metabolic processes are going to adapt to meet our individual needs and our environment. So, as you can imagine, an individual who is running a marathon is going to have a high need for that constant supply of energy versus an individual who's simply sitting on the couch and not necessarily needing as much physical energy, but they're still carrying out certain physiological processes in their body that are going to require this metabolism to continue to take place. Now, where does that metabolism take place? It takes place in our cells. Now, again, as I mentioned, these different cells perform different metabolic functions. So the cells in our eyes are going to be very different than the cells that are in our muscles or the cells that are in our organs, such as the liver. But if we look at each of these cells, you'll notice that the structure of these cells is very similar. They each have an outside of the cell known as a plasma membrane. This is essentially an outer envelope that holds in the cell's contents. So these cells have a plasma membrane, and if we were to cut open the plasma membrane and look within the interior of the cell, we'll see that there are organelles, these several organelles that are basically specialized internal structures within the cell. We have something known as a mitochondria, which is an organelle, one of the organelles inside of the cell. And it's in this mitochondria where it generates most of the cell's energy after those carbohydrates, proteins, and fats have entered the cell. So metabolism and that energy is going to take place in the mitochondria. The energy is generated in the mitochondria by aerobic metabolism, meaning it requires oxygen in the mitochondria to carry out that energy yielding process. We also have something on the interior of the cell known as cytosol. This is the fluid portion of the cell, and within the cytosol, any reactions that are taking place are anaerobic reactions. So this is anaerobic, meaning without oxygen. This is metabolism that's carried out without oxygen. Now, I talked about how every cell has these structures, and there's only one exception in the human body that does not have the same physiological cellular structure, and that is our red blood cells. Excuse me. The red blood cells are producing energy anaerobically in the cytoplasm. And you can think of the majority of our cells of that energy being generated in the mitochondria. Excuse me. So metabolism taking place within the cells. Here's that cell. I'm going to take the cell, and everyone, let's cut open that cell, open it up, and look at the exterior. We see that plasma membrane, which is containing all of the interior cellular structures. I have this fluid or liquid portion floating around the inside of the cell. This is known as the cytosol. And it's here where energy production and energy metabolism is carried out anaerobically without oxygen. We have some other organelles like the ribosomes, the nucleus, some smooth endoplasmic reticulum. But look here at this kidney-shaped organelle. This is known as the mitochondria. Mitochondria play a key role in that aerobic production of energy, meaning requiring oxygen. So you can think of the mitochondria as sort of this powerhouse of the cell because it's creating the power for the cell to carry out its necessary reactions. Okay? Now let's move away from the cell. Let's move to, now we're looking at the larger tissues and organs in our body. And we have the liver, which plays a very central role, as we've been learning, with the management of each energy yielding macronutrient that we consume. So when we're consuming carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, they get broken down and eventually absorbed and make their way to that liver. Also, we talked about the liver having been responsible for the metabolism of toxins in the body, such as alcohol. So the liver is the most metabolically active organ in the body. It's the first organ to metabolize, store, and distribute nutrients after absorption. So I always like to say the liver has a lot of hats to wear. It's a very important organ. It's going to take the energy yielding macronutrients that we consume, like the monosaccharides that are in carbohydrates, the amino acids that are in proteins, and the glycerol and fatty acids that are in fats, and either convert those nutrients into new compounds. So an example of this is taking the essential amino acids that we consume in our diet and converting them into a non-essential amino acid. And we also have different processes such as gluconeogenesis, where we're taking monosaccharides, the galactose and fructose, for example, and converting those into glucose, or converting amino acids into glucose, and basically transitioning from one molecule into another. So the liver can do that. It can create these new compounds. It's also responsible for turning products into energy. And so that's going to be a very important aspect of the liver. And it can store these for future use. Think about when our body has plenty of energy servicing the cells, then the liver says, okay, I don't need to supply the blood with any more glucose. I'm going to take that excess glucose and make glycogen. I'm going to store that glycogen in the liver and in the muscles. And I can also store any excess nutrients as fat or triglycerides. So the liver is making decisions as far as what the body's needs are in terms of how it's going to overlook our overall metabolism in the body. Now, metabolism itself is a series of metabolic pathways that are sequences of reactions that convert compounds from one form to another. So just as some of those examples we discussed. These metabolism is just, it's the sum of these chemical reactions. Now, when we talk about these specific chemical reactions, there are two main types, one known as anabolic and another known as a catabolic reaction. Now, some of you may have heard the term anabolic as in anabolic steroids. This is a type of steroid that might be used to build muscle mass, right? You might have heard of this. And anabolic is basically looking to take simple molecules and form larger molecules from them. So the process of taking smaller molecules such as glucose and forming that storage form glycogen is going to consume energy. It's going to require or absorb a certain amount of energy to make that happen. Same thing when we take amino acids and we try to create big proteins from those amino acids, that's going to take energy. And fatty acids and glycerol and storing those as triglycerides, again, it's consuming energy in order to create that anabolic reaction. Now, we also have something called a catabolic reaction. If the anabolic reactions are building up, then the catabolic reactions are breaking down. So we're taking the breakdown of glycogen, for example, breaking glycogen down into glucose units or proteins and breaking them down into amino acids, or triglycerides and breaking them down into fatty acids and glycerol. As you can imagine, this process is releasing energy. We're taking the bonds that are used to create that stored form of energy, we're breaking the bonds and we're releasing energy in the process. So anytime we're breaking down, we are releasing energy, and that is known as a catabolic reaction. Anabolic building up, catabolic breaking down. Here is a visual representation of each of those reactions. Here on the left, we have an anabolic reaction, taking that glucose, using energy in the form of this ATP. This is the molecule of energy known as adenosine triphosphate, which we're going to talk about. It's requiring energy to store that glucose as glycogen. We're building up these larger structures. Or we can take those larger structures and break them down and in the process release energy in the form of ATP and heat. So let's look at the overall ways in which we can regulate our metabolism. How does our body do that? Well, it does that through a series of different types of enzymes as well as hormones. Now, these enzymes allow for chemical reactions of metabolism to take place. And these are going to take place at a rate that is sufficient to maintain a normal body function. So whether I'm sitting on my couch, I need those enzymes to be working to facilitate my ability to sit on a couch and pay attention, or sit here and give a lecture. Or if I'm running a marathon, I'm going to have some enzymes working overtime to help facilitate those reactions in order to compensate for whatever needs I may have. Now, these enzymes, they don't work alone. We have enzymes that require something called a coenzyme to activate it. So a coenzyme is going to help facilitate and assist those enzymes. What are these coenzymes? You could think of these coenzymes as things like the B vitamins, for example. We're going to cover that in future chapters. But you may have heard that B vitamins act as coenzymes, and that's what they're doing. They're helping to facilitate this role in metabolic reactions. We also have certain hormones that are responsible for regulating these reactions. We have the hormone insulin. You may recall us talking about insulin in our carbohydrate chapter. Insulin is a hormone that gets released by our pancreas, and it's used in direct need for an anabolic type of reaction. In this case, where we're stimulating protein synthesis from amino acids, or we're stimulating glycogen synthesis from individual glucose units. It does not play a role in fat metabolism. So that insulin is facilitating an anabolic process, right? Our bodies are recognizing that it needs to go into a storage mode, right? Glucagon, on the other hand, does the opposite. It has the opposite effect on metabolism. It's going to prompt the body to start to break down those energy stores, and in the process, stimulate protein degradation and glycogenolysis, or the breakdown of that glycogen. So these are catabolic reactions that are taking place. It also stimulates lipolysis. Lysis bringing the breaking down of, and lipo meaning fat. So here we're breaking down glycogen, here we're breaking down fat, and this is all being governed by the release of glucagon from the pancreas. Next, we have epinephrine, and that is being released from the adrenal glands. This is also helping to facilitate a catabolic reaction. In this case, it's really governing the glycogenolysis effect and stimulating lipolysis. And finally, cortisol. Cortisol is that fight or flight hormone that we get when we need that burst of energy. What's that doing? That's actually going to stimulate protein degradation, stimulate gluconeogenesis. These are also catabolic reactions. So there's different hormones that are going to have a direct impact on the types of reactions that are taking place, whether they're anabolic or catabolic reactions in the body. All right, so I mentioned this compound known as ATP. What is ATP? Well, before the body can actually use energy from food, it's going to first disassemble those macronutrients into carbon dioxide and water, and capture the released energy as something known as adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine tri meaning 3, phosphate because it's using phosphate molecules. So this is composed of adenine. This is a nitrogen-containing unit, part of our DNA. Ribose, which is a 5-carbon sugar. And then we have these 3 phosphate molecules. This is just a highly sophisticated structure. I'm not going to quiz you on what it's composed of, but just know that ATP is a well-organized, physiologically designed compound that provides our cells with energy. Any source of macronutrients can be used to generate ATP. So whether we're talking about carbohydrates, fats, or proteins, each of these can be used as a fuel source of ATP. And ATP is the cell's direct energy source. Here I have it again. ATP is that cell's direct energy source. The cell cannot use a macronutrient directly. It's not going to take glucose and use glucose as the energy directly. If you're going to need energy, or you're going to need that cell to carry out a function and it requires energy, it's going to do that by breaking up that stored ATP that was generated through the metabolism of those nutrients, of those macronutrients. Now, this energy is stored in the bonds that connects the phosphate group. So if we look at that ATP molecule, it's a very special design, and there's very high amounts of energy that are stored in those phosphate groups. So we're going to talk a lot about that. Now, we know that the body must continuously produce ATP in order to provide a constant supply of energy to our bodies, right? We need to be alert at all times of the day. And we may not be running a marathon or riding a bike or walking upstairs, we still need to have these reactions taking place. So we need that energy throughout the day. But at any given moment, each individual cell only has about 3 to 5 seconds worth of ATP that's available for immediate use. And when the body needs that energy, one of the bonds that are connecting the phosphate groups becomes hydrolyzed. We're going to talk about that. It basically goes off of the ATP molecule, and it leaves that ATP molecule now as adenosine diphosphate, meaning it only has 2 phosphate molecules. This is what happens when one of those phosphate molecules is removed from the ATP. Let's look at what that means. So here we have this energy cycle. Now, when our bodies need energy, it's going to take this ATP energy molecule. Here's that adenine, here's the ribose, and here's those all-important 3 phosphate bonds. Now, our body, when it needs that energy, is going to take this ATP, release a phosphate, and it's going to, in the process, release a tremendous amount of energy that was stored in that bond. So you see, I can cleave that bond, I can hydrolyze that bond right off that ATP, and I'm going to release a lot of energy in the process. What do I have left? Well, I have ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So with the release of that 1 phosphate from ATP, now I have this new molecule of ADP that's been formed, and I can add a phosphate group back to that ADP to reform ATP. Now, you can imagine when I'm breaking it off, this is a catabolic reaction. I'm releasing energy. And when I'm adding the phosphate group back on, this is an anabolic reaction, and I'm basically going to put energy into the system in order to make that happen. Okay. All right, so now's a good time to say how I'm going to, well, now I'm going to move on to the ATP and ADP in this process that we just covered. The video is talking about this anaerobic metabolism, and this is a type of metabolism that takes place in the presence of that lactic acid buildup. So anytime you've ever been lifting weights, for example, and you feel that sort of lactic acid, that burning sensation that's felt during that muscle being overused, this is known as an anaerobic metabolism. Basically, anaerobic metabolism is producing less ATP per minute than aerobic metabolism. So we produce less energy every minute. It's only providing 1 to 1.5 minutes of maximal activity. And this is what's involved in high intensity, short duration activities such as sprinting and heavy weightlifting. As you can imagine, there's a tremendous amount of energy that's going to be required to carry out any one of these types of functions, like a sprinting and a heavy weightlifting. We are needing that we're not using oxygen. We're basically needing that energy in this anaerobic environment. Now we have aerobic metabolism. Now this is going to produce more ATP per minute than anaerobic metabolism. And basically, this is able to continue indefinitely. So think about these low intensity, long duration activities like fast walking, maybe a light jog. This is when that demand for ATP is greater than the rate of metabolism. The activity is going to start to slow down. But in general, we can continuously regenerate that ATP during this aerobic metabolism. So just keep that in mind. During anaerobic metabolism, like heavy weightlifting, we're not able to generate as much ATP as we are during aerobic metabolism, such as a light jog. Now, I'm going to leave it here before we start talking about metabolic changes in the body. And the reason is because I want you to read the chapter, but take special notes of the concepts that I'm covering and the concepts that I'm not covering. We are not going to talk about the individual cycles and the metabolic pathways that are involved for these metabolic reactions to occur. For instance, we're not going to cover glycolysis or the TCA cycle. So just know that when you're reading these chapters, if it's something I didn't cover in this lecture, you're not responsible for knowing it on the exam. So I just want you to take special note of that. And when we come back next time, we are going to talk about ways in which our bodies are sophisticated enough to be able to change our metabolic rates depending on how long it's been since we've had our last meal. So we're going to talk about different states in which our bodies are in. So until that time, I hope you all have a wonderful day and take care. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.